So, again, another episode of the segment. And this time I'm super excited to welcome Kyla Guru. She has the most incredible background and incredible story. So, without further ado, I want to just get straight into that. Kyla, welcome to the segment.
Thank you. Thank you, Raghu. And thank you for having me, Illumio.
It's our pleasure to have you on this podcast. And I mean, normally we have a little sort of intro that I narrate about our guest, but I think only you could do it justice. So tell us about your background. And I'll leave the question at that.
Yeah, I can take you back to where it all began. So I'm Kyla, and I am a student right now at Stanford University. I study computer science and international relations. And I am now a master's student, but back in the day, way back when I was 14 years old, that's when my journey in cyber really began. I was entering high school. I think it was the very beginning of like freshman year. And I was starting to get interested in cybersecurity. I did a couple of summer camps in cyber. I got super interested and I just Googled like summer camps near me in cyber. And when I found the nearest one, I went to it. And from that's really what kicked off this larger journey. And the journey kind of came when I came back from the summer camp. I realized that these were lessons that I learned that were not just isolated or should not just be isolated to 1 week of learning at a summer camp. It felt like to me that this is the kind of like common knowledge that people should have in mind as they're going through the internet. And it really was just that one thought that occurred to me. And from then I started looking at, okay, how can we actually educate individuals about this kind of cyber threats, these cyber risks in their own lives, and empower them to feel like when they're on the internet, they can exercise their skills that they've learned. So I looked into existing cyber education programs in my area and NGOs that existed. And at the time, a lot of the things that I saw online were very reactive and not proactively educating individuals just for the sake of educating them and proactively. So when I talked to my local CIO and CISO of my neighborhood, they also mentioned that a lot of the efforts that they took were reactive. And that's when I was like, okay, maybe it's time that somebody did something a little bit more on the proactive side. So I started looking at how could I spin up a cyber education program on a very local level, just biking to my local elementary school and providing them 5 or 10 minute lessons whenever the kids were free. And that really snowballed into what is now today Bits and Bytes Cybersecurity Education Nonprofit, which is I'm happy to say an international nonprofit that's dedicated to working on cyber education and making cyber education more accessible for all populations across the board. So a long story short is I have been leading these education efforts for quite some time now, almost 8 years. And along the way, I also started a women's tech conference called GirlCon conference. That was because I somehow realized like whenever I would go into these rooms of cyber professionals, there was a jarring imbalance between the men and women in the room, and the gender imbalance was pretty prominent, especially in rooms as I escalated the levels and went to levels of like board levels or CEO levels, C-level conversations. I noticed just this like very jarring shift. So from then I started a women's tech conference. So that is also running today. We just had our 7th annual event. So continuing to grow in the community, and I myself personally continuing to grow as a leader and a learner. So very exciting journey.
Okay. Um, I'm just in awe of all of that. So let me just take a moment to just sort of let that sink in. Um, I want to go back because I want to explore lots of what you just said in a bit more detail. But let's go back um, to 14, and you said you got interested in cyber. So I have young kids, and our oldest is not much younger than 14, and he's not particularly interested in cyber. So what got you hooked? Like what attracted you to it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it was honestly these dinner conversations that my family would have.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad used to be a fraud investigator in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
He is not a cyber professional, but he is an accountant by trade, by
Mm-hmm.
training. And just because of that, he is privy to things like money fraud and financial
Mm.
crime. So he used to start to talk about these things. And he one day took me to one of his professional uh, events where they brought in a speaker, and the speaker was an ex-financial criminal, and he was kind of
Mm-hmm.
discussing his way of working and why he did what he did, and he was informing a room of accountants about, okay, here's how you do due diligence and do auditing for next time. And
Mm-hmm.
that, like, it was conversations like that that made me initially kind of interested in, like, what is this space, like, who are the people that try and defend against these things and understand these individuals. And I really think it could have gone the other way where I wasn't interested in cyber, but it was something about that first camp that I did at Gen Cyber. And I think a part of it was that they just showed us professors, for example, professors who were doing digital forensics and
Mm.
professors who are looking at the psychology behind cyber
Mm.
criminals, just very cool parts. And it just seemed very interdisciplinary to me. Like,
Yeah.
you didn't need to just be a computer science professional to understand this field or to be an expert in this field. And that was exciting, that it
Mm.
seemed like a little bit of everything. And yeah, but I think it varies for everyone. I would say, like, maybe having kids watch more like movies, like those spy movies, also helps. Oh, one of the things I did do when I was younger was I watched the show called The Arrow.
Mm-hmm.
And in The Arrow, there's like a hacker woman who helps the superhero, and she's kind of like the savior underground who saves the day, doing all the little like logistics, like go here,
Mm-hmm.
tag this man, like things like that. And so I saw Felicity Smoke, and I really could see myself. Like, that was the first time that I could see myself represented through a media. And that's when I was like, okay, maybe this is something that I could actually do, and this would be really, really cool. So that's also a part of it, I think.
I think definitely. I think cyber could do with a lot more the image of being cool, right? In a way that, to some extent, sort of the startup culture has made becoming a developer be cool, right? Which it
Yeah.
definitely wasn't a cool profession 30 years ago, right? But now
Yeah.
it's kind of everyone wants to be a developer. That's incredible. So, and then you spoke about how you sort of went down and you spoke to the CISO or the CIO of your local community. I wouldn't like. I wouldn't even know who to go and who that would be in our community. So, but and you said and their reaction was a lot of our cyber education, how we talk about cyber is very, very reactive, right? So
Hmm.
something bad happens and then we react to it and say, oh, like, let's avoid this in the future. Let's say passwords as an example. Yes, don't use your pet's name as a password, right?
Hmm.
Go and change it and etc. So what what were the things that you started to introduce that got on that sort of proactive approach to cyber education?
Yeah. And initially it started super small, right?
Mm-hmm.
The thing that the school agreed to, and obviously along this path, there was a partnership with this first school, and the school kind of had to agree when I proposed something. So the first thing was a 5-minute informational video that
Mm-hmm.
was animated for the students. And so I made this video. I think it was on like this very old animation software that is now, I think they might be still around, Powtoon, but I just made it during my Thanksgiving break,
Mm-hmm.
and I presented it. I went into the school to present it, and it was that like reaction to the presentation that I think kicked off a lot more dominoes. Like, the first reaction, the students were just very engaged, interacting, asking questions, like what kind of passwords are you talking about? Should I care about my email password? I have an email account with the school. Like very critical thinking questions. Like you could tell that they were starting to think about how security fit into their own lives. And that's when I was like, okay, maybe this could be something that's relevant to other schools, like not just these students in my own community. Because my community was pretty forward leaning. Like we had Chromebooks and devices one-to-one for students. And I just imagined like all the different communities on the spectrum of tech accessibility. I figured if we're not doing much cyber education, then I can't imagine, broadly what cyber education looks like. So, and at the time we didn't have like a K-12 standard curriculum for cyber. So that is what kicked it off. And then from then I started a website. I started pushing out more resources. It was really the first domino, I would say.
And I'd say that the cyber education is so important. And I mean, in the corporate world, like every organization, large and small, has some form of security awareness training, right, that you attest to on an annual basis, and it's great. And I've seen it in my kids' schools where, from a very young age, they're taught about being safe online, being secure online. And it's always funny when I sort of hear my kids come and tell me about how to go and detect like a phishing attack, right, or and so on. But my question is always, awareness is so important, but how do we measure the impact of that? So yes, we all know that like we should have strong passwords, as an example, or in this case, we sort of talk about like moving to passphrases or even with passwordless, which is the big movement at the moment. But how are we measuring the effectiveness of awareness, and how do we know it's actually having an impact in improving cybersecurity?
Impact is hard to measure. It's probably the hardest question that NGOs and nonprofits deal with too, is how do you know that what you're educating about really doesn't happen? Because the ultimate measure of success is a reduction in cybercrime or a reduction in cyber threats. And that's even for folks in industry, that's a very hard thing to measure. So I would say a couple of ways that we mitigate that is we have immediate measurements. So short-term measurements, for example, we send out a survey right after our programs, and that captures a lot of the immediate, like, do you feel more safe after the session? Would you like to see more of this content? That sort of immediate reaction. And then we also, in that, we ask them questions that are sort of getting at like, what did they actually learn through the session? Sometimes we do some like multiple choice to just see, are they picking up on the content and are they having an awareness of it? And then we also do kind of longer term programming where we can see students multiple times, or we see students the next year, the following year, and we also see, okay, like longitudinal studies of like, do they feel like they are more likely to go into cyber because of these programs? And it's that part is like through qualitative and quantitative measures, like talking to them and chatting with them about how their year has been and how has Bits and Bytes impacted them, and then also quantitatively through those surveys. So it's a little bit of both. I would say in general, a lot of the impact for NGOs broadly and also for Bits and Bytes is through the narratives and stories that students share. And a lot of them have been really powerful. For example, students who've been able to get shadowing opportunities based on the conferences that we host and the events that we host. And then we also have had students who share that their sister had experienced like a similar scam or a similar data breach situation, and they finally understood what exactly had happened during the session. Like they'll share those kind of like story things like in the survey as well, and those are really interesting to read because they make you feel like they've actually connected something. And yeah, I think the real ultimate impacts or the vision would be that 5-10 years down the line, when these folks do enter industry, they are highly security minded professionals and folks.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think what you said really at the beginning of that particular um, segment around measuring the impact of any of these programs is difficult, right? We can measure attendance, we can measure engagement in the program, but which are all important measures. But then actually measuring have we improved our cybersecurity posture as a result is really difficult. And you see the data, and you look at number of cyber attacks that were successful, and that number, or even number of cyber attacks attempted, that number is just going up and up and up. Right, it's definitely not trending downwards. And then you look at what was the initial attack sort of vector, that initial sort of way of intrusion, and it's pretty much always some kind of like phishing, social engineering attack, right? A phishing email. And I was talking to a head of a security architect at RSA, and he goes, the problem that I have is that so he was French Canadian. He goes, the problem that I have is my users are what we say in French, clicker compulsive. They will click on absolutely anything, and as a result, I need to then build in controls that sort of almost have to think about what happens after boom, because that I can't stop boom, and whatever awareness training I do, it has little impact. And I remember a sticker on my former manager's desk, and what it said was there is no patch for human stupidity. And I kind of think about that when I think about cybersecurity, is that we're almost what we're doing in many ways is essentially building controls that mitigate what a human will ultimately do, right? Not out of not because they intend to, but often out of ignorance. So
Yeah.
like how I know all the awareness that programs like yours are bringing is important to sort of up level that. And I don't mean to be sort of obviously I'm just sort of being sort of jokey around with the term of human stupidity, but like, what is the impact you have seen?
Yeah, great question. And that is, I feel like, a very common mindset in security. I think there's actually been like papers and studies done around it about, especially in the design field, of when do we blame the user versus when do we blame the designer. And I think in security, there's this mindset that like, we're trying our best, like it's all on the end user, after we develop it, it's out of our hands, and they're the ones clicking the links and doing all these things. But at the end of the day, like even developers are human, and some of these threats and attacks are, if you look at them, they're getting so real and they feel so emotional. And that's the whole point of them, right? They're trying to kind of make you emotionally stimulated such that you do something that you normally wouldn't. And as humans, like we all have that tendency. And it's just about like, I think especially with this generation, we're already kind of savvy to it. If you've spoken to people of the generation, like we've grown up around these threats. We know about creepy Instagram DMers. Like that's us, that's like the back of our hands at this point. It's just a matter of like putting names to those situations and teaching it as like, this is actually a matter of national security. Like you're actually a part of this whole like circle of security that we have. And so I think that's the biggest piece, is the empowerment piece. It's less about, I think the awareness I find like comes really easy because they're almost already aware. It's more about like empowering them to know like, this is how to answer your questions. Like a lot of them have a lot of questions that just need answering. Like what is like, what does this privacy policy really mean at the end of the day? Or what is Snapchat doing with my data? Like, does it host it on device or in servers? Like they have complicated questions that even developers, would be like thinking again to answer. So I guess that's a long way of saying that empowerment is really important, even beyond awareness. And I find that like I'm constantly amazed by the things that like students and kids know. So it makes my job really easy as I'm going in to talk about security, because oftentimes they create the conversation already with so many questions.
That's awesome. So I wanted to kind of just go on onto that a bit more. Yeah.
Oh, yes, let me just tie it up. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Okay.
In the video there'll be a jump where suddenly your hair appears here, right? It's like, how did that happen? And is that the real Kyla, or is it a deep fake now?
It's the hologram.
It's the hologram, yeah, exactly. So I want to explore that human element in cybersecurity a bit more, because one of the trends that we're seeing in cyber within organizations, in terms of the strategies that organizations are adopting, is one around zero trust, right? And specifically, and by zero trust, we don't mean removing trust completely, because if that was the case, then you might as well disconnect everything from the network and be done, right? So it's about removing sort of implicit, freely available trust. But then on the human side, so much of what we do on a day-to-day basis depends on implicit trust, right?
Yeah.
And I know I've had conversations with, and this is particularly sensitive in particular geographies, where they just hearing the word zero trust causes offense, because, oh, how can that be, right? It means that you don't trust me as a user, and you don't trust what I do. How does, and you may not have had conversations specifically around zero trust, but how do you balance that in the education programs around, don't have such implicit trust with what you do online, but that doesn't mean that you compromise your ability to trust individuals, real humans?
Yeah. I I feel like zero trust is tricky for that reason. It's because you don't want to give the notion that you shouldn't trust others completely, or that you shouldn't trust yourself online, like more of a less empowering note. But I think like trust but verify is a good stance that I usually teach, like in terms of disinformation and information warfare. Is like verification is incredibly important, and then also I think just changing the terminology to be like, yes, zero trust is incredibly important, but it's like scaffolded within these like many things. Like there's a reason why we don't trust like immediately, and there's all these case studies for when we did trust immediately, and like scaffolding it within a greater lesson to then brand it as zero trust. Like I think zero trust is a loaded statement. It's not just like nothing, like no trust at all. It's like trust but verify is generally the idea behind it. We just say like zero trust because that makes you feel like, okay, I have to start at ground level. But I think in terms of an education aspect, like meeting students where they're at and bringing them these case studies or these instances of like, this is what we mean by zero trust. Because at that time, they might not have seen the real world use case of like zero trust in terms of like authentication or giving privileges to folks. So giving them examples that make it feel more real is definitely one of the mitigations to that.
Yeah, I really like what you said there about sort of starting at ground level and then building the scaffolding, right? It's again, and you make it very real, because let's just say that you're meeting a stranger, right? You don't associate a high level of trust necessarily till you have validated like who they are, etc. And multiple factors. If you've been sort of connected through a friend, then there is some level of, okay, there's some level of initial verification that's been done. So it kind of moves that up a notch, versus, let's say, someone that you may have just connected together on LinkedIn, but no sort of really formal referral or validation. It's sort of, okay, maybe I'm sort of a slightly notch lower. And I think this is, and applying that same principle to how you deal with technology and systems, that same common sense approach, because ultimately you get to a point where you say you've established enough validation that you say, okay, I can trust this person or this technology to a certain
Yeah.
extent. And I think, yeah, grounding in that common sense is absolutely right.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Like, I think mirroring all the things digitally, physically always helps with education because people generally understand, like, okay, I have to lock my car before I leave, or I have to
Mm.
lock the door before I sleep. Like, those are very important elements to us, like values that we hold close. But just translating that to cyber is that key piece of education that, oh, this is the same digitally. Imagine if somebody had access to your physical location or your GPS
Mm.
coordinates at every time. Like, that is the sort of mindset that you should have in terms of thinking about your threat model.
And that's a great thing. And let's come on to threat modeling in a second. But that analogy, I think, is really important. Is that for your own precious things, physical objects that you want to protect, you're very wary, right? You lock your doors. You maybe put, so let's say, precious things in a safe, or you put them in a lockbox in a vault or something like that, right? So but when it comes to how we interact online, it's almost like what we want is ease of use, ease of access. I need to be able to do something quickly. Just because it's online and it's electronic, the
Yes.
barriers to being productive suddenly seem to be need to be reduced. And I think we need to again apply that same level of sort of inspection and care that we would to physical objects.
Yes. And I think it's not only a user thing. I think the internet was almost designed such that there's this trade-off, or this seeming trade-off between convenience and security.
Yeah.
And it's sometimes it's not even just a user decision. And we make it really hard as designers to incentivize the user to choose to be secure.
Mm.
So I think what I'm seeing now is I'm liking all these movements towards building insecurity or baking insecurity
Yeah.
into the product so that the user either A, doesn't even have to think about security, or security is something that they can toggle on and off, like, or toggle from like a crazy like locked up setting to like, oh, just secure by default. Like, I don't know if you've looked at Apple's lockdown mode, but that is, Apple's products are obviously secure by design, but they have an additional layer of security if you are a high risk individual. So it's designs like that that really push the needle forward in terms of the user doesn't even have to make that decision at the end of the day, which is in physical security when we're locking doors or locking cars, when we're doing like that cost benefit analysis, the calculus makes sense in our head. Like, we're not losing anything by taking extra precautions. And I think that's how we should try and build devices on the internet, product devices that users are using. Is thinking about security as something that shouldn't have to leave anything else behind.
Right, and it's second nature. And just going back to your car analogy, when you walk away from your car, you don't say, actually, I can't be bothered to lock the car because that's one more button click, right?
Yeah.
You just do it. It's
Exactly.
subconsciously you do it. But I want to go to you started talking about secure by design and incorporating security into the product development lifecycle. Right, and I think that this is a really interesting evolution, because if we think about sort of historically the security function and the role that security has played, and again, like simplifying it significantly, a lot of for a very long time, and still largely today, security plays the role of being an approval function. So it's like you come and ask the security team, can I do something? And they say yes or no. And often you come to them once you have got to the end of whatever it is you're building, and then you want the can you bless it, please? Right. Whereas I think and that's always the challenge, that then let's say security says no, right? And then you say, oh, then you go back, and so that really hampers productivity. Or security says, well, no, and here are all your risks, and you say, well, okay, well, I'll just accept the risk, right? Because I need to be productive, and you put something out that's insecure. But I think what you said about incorporating security into the process much early on, I would say almost at the beginning, makes security an assurance function. Then, which means that because you've already incorporated security into the entire design and build process, when you deploy something, you know that it's secure.
Hmm.
So that, and it's almost like if I deploy it back to the same pattern, I know that's going to be secure because I can only do things that are secure. And I think that is the larger cultural shift that we kind of need to push towards.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think I had a professor once who said this one quote that I've always remembered in this context. It's he said security is always thought as part of the plumbing,
Mm,
but security is really has to be thought as part of the problem and
yeah,
part of the initial problem statement. So it's not only how can we do this, but how can we do this safely and how can we keep our users safe and secure. So I think when I look towards good design practices and good design values, I think that's going to be something that customers hold companies like accountable for.
mm,
And I think you see that kind of through Apple products in what they do and live and breathe, but also through a lot of different design solutions now, like especially two-factor apps that make it
yeah.
super easy for you to do two-factor without even thinking. Like you just open the app and it already verifies you. And that's the sort of design changes that I think are both secure and safe, but they're also well designed, very
Yeah,
convenient, easy to use,
yeah,
beautifully looking. Like, so that is, I think that's the next generation of design and security. And I really wish that more schools who teach design have some sort of class for designing for safety and security. Because
mm,
I'll say, like, even in a CS program at my school, you kind of have to build your own path and figure out how exactly am I going to learn about this in a classroom
mm.
setting so that I have the skills required. There's all sorts of other classes like designing for accessibility and designing for game design, but I think designing for safety and security is really the next generation.
Absolutely, but it's also good to know that in 25 years, uh, computer science courses haven't, while they continue to teach security, they haven't yet fully incorporated security into all aspects of the course, and it's very much a standalone, a standalone discipline. Um,
Yeah, I could go on about this forever, and this always makes me want to become a policymaker to change this fact. But there's some crazy statistic out there that says that out of the top 14 computer science programs in the country, only one of those programs requires developers to take a security class. In the other schools, mine included, security is not a required class. You can take it if you want to learn
mm.
more about it, but oftentimes you can graduate without having taken one at all. It's
Yeah, and
crazy
that's
fact.
and as someone who's worked in cyber for almost 20 years now, um, and just thinking about the number of graduates who are coming out wanting to enter technology in whatever industry, but essentially in technology and develop incredible products. The fact that they don't necessarily have a solid background in cyber. I'm not saying being experts, but awareness and like that's some like key skills which are going to be important for their role. That's quite scary because it's again goes back to what are those things that we are developing and using and sort of how much security grounding is in them. And I know organizations put a lot of effort into sort of making up for that.
Yeah.
But it feels like in the same way that you are addressing the challenge of cyber education at such a young age, at sort of the school age, that this is something that at higher education, it's something that could be fairly easily addressed and is pretty essential if we're saying that, oh well, everyone needs to be able to learn to code because it's
Hmm.
essential for whatever job they're going to do. Well, let's ensure that they can code securely.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that that's going to be a massive change in the education system. And I really hope that it happens and that I think we bring up upon the right tools. Like, I think there are quite a few startups and emerging companies working on how do we get tools to developers such that it makes security like really easy to understand, like especially in documentation that you don't know as well. So I think that with the right tools and with the right foundation of education, and just even like a mere interest in like wanting to know about this. Like, I think it goes back to what you were originally saying of like developers not having this stereotype or this perspective that security folks are always going to come in and be like, you can't do that, sir. Sorry. Like you can't develop, you can't. That's generally the sense that people get, especially with this whole AI revolution, that, if I bring in a security personnel or if I become security minded, like maybe I will not develop as fast or I won't innovate as quickly. But I think knocking down that stereotype that you can be developing just as quickly, but also with safety in mind. And there's so many examples of that. That is really the key piece, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one part of it is obviously changing that mindset and kind of really making, and this is the onus on this is very much on the cybersecurity industry, is make yourselves a partner, right? Make yourselves don't feel that you have to be the yes no police, but much more about a partner, because that's what's going to drive more engagement and more adoption. But also, I think the onus is also on like security vendors, those who develop security products and security technologies, to make them as easy to leverage as possible by those who are creating applications, right? By the end users, so that like adopting security becomes a joy. I mean, to your point, right? We're so obsessed about user experience. It's so important. Like if you're designing a consumer product and the user experience is poor, right? That product is not going to go far, right? It will get slaughtered. So we should take the same approach to security products, which maybe enterprise products, maybe end user products, but let's make security a joy to adopt.
Yeah, and also easier to adopt. I think one of the things that I struggle with sometimes is advising when small medium-sized businesses come and they're like, oh, we're looking for security product. Like they do want to be secure or adopt something. There's just so many tools out there that it's hard to parse now. Like, okay, what is exactly, like, what are you actually doing? Like, what? So I think just getting a general understanding of the communicating your product according to what it does and then who you wanting to serve. That's also a big thing because there's so many products out there right now.
Yeah. So I want to talk about AI with you in a bit, but I mean, you're not just a cyber educator, right? You're not just someone who's focused on sort of building awareness. You're also a threat hunter. You're deep in the weeds of the technology. So, like, talk a bit about that. Like, what is that aspect of your day-to-day life?
Yeah, I would say it really spun out of my interest in this education component. So I was doing education all throughout high school, education and advocacy of cyber. And then when I got to college, I started getting more interested in, okay, who are these actual threat actors and why are they doing what they do and how are they doing what they do? Like, what are their tactics and techniques? And so that's when I started getting into threat intelligence. And threat intelligence, I worked at the MSISAC for a year, and then I moved over to Apple to do security operations there and do fraud detection using AI and ML. And then I moved to government and did work at CISA that was totally centered around international cyber capacity building and helping our partners and our supply chain partners with their security. And then I moved back to Apple, did product security with civil society partners, so protecting journalists, dissidents, and human rights defenders. And I got really interested in government-backed attacks. And that's also what I'm doing this summer at SpaceX, working on government attackers and government attacks to our products. And that is also what I research on. So it's just like a lot of passion just built up because of the education side, seeing the actual victims, seeing people who had been through things like this. We've done a lot of sessions with victims of online exploitation as well. And so just generally having exposure to the people on the other side of the attacks, I think has fueled a lot of this interest of mine to get to know this field so well. And I think it's just brought me deeper and deeper into these rabbit holes of cyber, but I wouldn't have it any other way. It's a lot of fun to do the research and do the education component together.
I mean, that's pretty much a who's who of public and private sector organizations that you've done cybersecurity work in. Can I just say that most people who make a career in cyber haven't done anything cyber related till they're in their 30s. So you've already got like a 15-year head start on the rest of us. It's not fair. But it's interesting you're sort of looking at like nation state actors, and so if we tie something that we were speaking about earlier about how the rise of cyber attacks. Right. So on one side, the likes of nation state actors and just kind of the general narrative is, look, attackers are getting more and more sophisticated. Right. They have all of these new incredible tools, and of course, there's now with AI being so accessible, then there's obviously the whole narrative around like AI powered attackers and all these things, right? But what I would say is that the majority of attacks that we see today, and the majority of as the number of attacks increase, the majority of these attacks aren't super sophisticated attacks, right? They're often just attempting the same things again and again and again because the same vulnerabilities are there still to be exploited. The same misconfigurations are there still to be exploited, right? And attackers aren't really having to work hard. I was having this conversation with someone, I think just yesterday, saying, you know what? If the number of sophisticated attacks was increasing, I would actually say that's a good thing, because it means that on the defender's side, our controls, our ability to prevent, detect, contain all of these kind of the 80% of attacks has been really good, which means attackers are forced to do something different. But I feel that attackers aren't really having to work that hard to be successful still.
Yeah, I guess the big thing right now is ransomware, and criminals have realized that they can ransomware different orgs with the same vulnerabilities and they can actually profit off of it. So I think you're right that there is a pattern in the vulnerabilities that are exploited. There's a pattern in the tactics and techniques that are used by threat actors. So I think that's an interesting thing you say. Like, I've never actually thought about it in that way of like shifting our perspective to government-backed attacks. But I think all around, like regardless if it's like government, small business, individual, civilian, everybody has a threat model. And the fact that like last summer taught me working in civil society was just that even if you are a civilian, there's also like layers to that. Like what organizations are you a part of? Who are you meeting on a regular basis? Like, could you be the target of a government-backed attack? And so I think that taught me that even as a civilian, you should be worried or wondering about your threat model. And, you know, positively paranoid, I guess, like paranoid, but also empowered about it after, which is a tricky balance, but yeah.
Yeah, because it's I think for me, it gets, what gets me frustrated is you look at, and I was doing this yesterday for a bit of research, you go through sort of the detailed reports of cyber attacks, right? And you look back, let's say you look back and start with target and then move forward, right? And just pick up every detailed report, and the same things keep cropping up, right? And it's almost, you can circle them and say, look, right, here are the tactics, techniques, procedures that have worked for the last 10 years. and then yet, so have you fixed those? Have you addressed those, right? Can you confidently say that those techniques and procedures will not work, and okay, fine, the tactics will still largely be the same, but they'll have to use different techniques and procedures.
Hmm.
But if you can't say that those sort of those common items you've addressed, you really shouldn't be talking about, well, I need to go and solve for this new AI powered attacker, right? I'm sort of
Yeah.
making stuff up here, but that's the frustration that drives me is that there is so much that is just low hanging fruit that we could go and address as defenders, but yet we're chasing the shiny object. I mean, what's your perception of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think even having been on the pen testing side too, it's interesting because I feel like every time I did one of those learning experiences and I was on a pen testing assessment or I kind of saw it from start to finish, I would always go back to the education piece. And I think that a part of that was because like every time I realized that the initial vector that was used like 80% of the time is through humans.
Yeah.
And so regardless if it's an attacker who has access to AI, because then it only makes their job easier, right? To generate some sort of email that through AI, or generate a voicemail that's AI generated, or a voice that's AI generated, and conduct that initial vector of the attack. I think every single time I just found myself going back to the education piece, which I think is a big reason for why I haven't stopped doing that ever since I began when I was 14. So I would say that you're right, that even with artificial intelligence, we should just think about how, our defense in depth, our security posture hasn't necessarily changed that much. Like it has changed like in terms of improved, but it's a cat and mouse game, and the threat actors are also improving. So we have to adapt. It's not just a one and done. I've done my security. I'm done with it. I'm not going to think about it. It's more so, okay, can we revise this now that the threat actors are evolving? What can we do to just stay ahead of the needle? And I think as designers, that's a big thing to think about when you're thinking about designing a product, is like, okay, if I build this, if I design this way, how would attackers try and go around it? And what is their next move?
And that's brilliant, right? Because that's very much a like a threat centric approach to building product. Or like we talk about when we talk about sort of zero trust, we're talking about it as sort of assume intrusion, assume the attacker is inside. How would you then how would you then build your controls, build your security so that they can't actually get any further, right? And I think that's absolutely the case, because when I think about this with relation, let's say, to AI powered attackers, it's ultimately what is the fuel for the AI model? It's data, it's information about whether it's about you, about your organization, about the infrastructure that you have. So the less of that you make freely available, right, the less the attacker has to work with. So it's kind of starving. Like we talk about reducing the attack surface, right, or managing our attack surface, but it's also like managing the learning surface. Like what is that surface that is exposed that the attacker can just learn from?
Yeah. I totally agree. And I've spent the last year looking at the use of large language models to conduct cyber defense and to extract or identify tactics and techniques after an attack. And the things that you learn in terms of using artificial intelligence, fine tuning it to be a productive tool, is just that our AI is definitely developed, but it's definitely has its nuances, right? Like when you interact with an LLM, you can definitely tell that it's hallucinating quite a bit and things like that. So I think everyone is on this, like on the playing field is level in that sense, that like they're operating with the same level of tools that we are. Let's just try and build faster. Let's build like defensive tools faster. Let's evade these potential risks faster than they do.
So and so how do you see AI transforming the cybersecurity landscape? Like, what do you think is the key thing that it could be used to address?
There's so many little subtasks, I think, but I think the way that AI engineers are looking at it, as well as cyber professionals, is again, it's this idea of like how can we meet each other where we're at, right? It's not that AI is going to be used to replace cyber professionals, but it's rather how can we find those like small subtasks
Mm,
that actually, if a human analyst wasn't spending so much time on this, they could actually put their human analyst efforts
mm,
into a harder task or into a harder human required subtask. So I think that has been my focus, is how do I find these smaller subtasks that we could actually create benchmarks. And then that's the second thing, is like, how do you actually scientifically rigorously test this so that
mm,
we know that an LLM model would be useful for a task or would
mm.
be good for a task? And that is the huge, like, I think academic research question right now is, yes, there's like all these tools coming out. Every cyber vendor claims to have an AI
Yeah,
powered product. But at the same time, if you look at the research, there's not a lot of like LLM benchmarks for like, okay, this is
yeah.
how humans perform at this task. This is how the LLM performs. Let's actually
Mm.
do like a side by side comparison. And let's do that at scale hundreds of times to see actually like, would this be a potential tool? So I think that is the next stage of like academic research, is like, can we produce benchmarks that provide like scientifically rigorous evidence? Because again,
Yeah.
this is the cyber industry we're talking about. We need evidence for something to
Yes.
be like high stakes decisions, right? So
Absolutely. I was talking to a former colleague last night,
mhm.
and we were talking about this because he's in the middle of sort of building out a startup that's sort of heavily leveraging AI for the technology they're building, and we were talking and sort of talking about, okay, well, how is we hear this conversation, we hear a lot about sort of cybersecurity vendors saying, oh, we're AI powered, right?
Yeah.
If you walked around, I'm sure you came to RSA this year, and you walked around, and if you didn't have AI somewhere on your booth, you're probably sort of no one came and stopped at you, right? Because you clearly can't be doing anything serious if you're not doing AI. And we were talking last night, like, and we were talking about, okay, well, what's AI like? Convince me that AI is really useful, right? And then I think what we nailed down to, and it summarizes, I think, what you said is, what are um, the day-to-day tasks that I hate doing but I have to do? And if I can use AI, if AI can understand what those tasks are and do those for me,
Hmm.
that's really useful, because then I can focus, to your point, on things that I really want to do, that I can't, because I'm spending so much time on these things that I have to do but I hate doing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And I think when I talk to people in the public sector too, in terms of like what are the adoptions that the government is looking towards in terms of AI, it's kind of the same thing. It's like all these little, it's not the sexy problems that
Yes,
that they're
yes.
looking at. It's everything, from hiring and HR to figuring out how to onboard somebody, that like a new employee, how to onboard them without spending too many resources and human effort. Like how can we use these tools to actually better what we do and augment what we do? um, and
uh,
yeah, I think one of my professors put it very interestingly. It's about intelligence augmentation
yes.
instead of automation.
Yes, absolutely right. And I'm going to go to one. It's not the sexy problems you're trying to solve for; it's the shit problems that you're trying to solve for, right? And
Yeah.
the ones that you have to absolutely solve on a day-to-day basis. Um, yes, I completely agree, and I think that's why the AI sort of age, the revolution, has so many parallels with those other leaps in sort of technology that we've seen over the last few hundred years, right? It's not it's essentially enabling us, taking away some of those very manual things, right?
Hmm.
Like going back to, let's say, the introduction of steam power, right? Or whether that's the automobile, all very, very similar things. it just gave us time back.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I think we should think about it, at least for now. That's awesome. So let's think about like when you look into your crystal ball, right? About cyber, about policy, about the human element, about AI. What do you see as the future?
Dang, $1 million question.
Billion
I
dollar question if you get the idea right.
exactly. Dang, I got to build my startup right after this. But I think it's a number of things in the cyber industry. I feel like there's so much going on right now. It's hard to pin down one thing, but I do think if I could sum it up, it's going to be, as you said, this fine balance of where do we draw the line between human analysis and intelligence augmentation. And if somebody gets that right, I think that is going to be the $1 billion tool is, can you build something that augments intelligence, that makes us smarter defenders, but also leverages what humans do best, which is anomaly detection or figuring out that something is just a little bit off or weird that a machine might not be able to pick up on. And it's fine tuning that sort of problem statement that's going to, I think, push the needle far.
So when is your startup coming out of stealth?
I know this is a soft launch for a stealth.
It's a soft launch for it. Okay. And I'm auditioning for a role in it as well. Fantastic. So let's bring it back to education and awareness as we wrap up, right? And there are going to be so many security professionals that will be listening to this podcast, right? What is the message that you have, your connection to sort of those who are still coming through their high schooling, right, coming through college, but also you've had all of that exposure in high-end public sector, high-end private sector, right? What is your message to the cybersecurity professionals of today that they should be aware of about the cybersecurity professionals of tomorrow?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. So one is that it all starts, it's very grassroots. If there's one message I could send to cyber professionals in the working industry, that it all comes back to your community, to your impact, to the message that you send. So I always recommend get out into local schools, talk about what you do, and bring that image that we were talking about in the beginning, right? That cyber is not just this one type of person or this one background that's required. It's everywhere and it's everything. Yesterday I was talking to a friend. I was like, you don't choose cyber. Cyber chooses you. So that's the thing is get out into the community, share about what you do, present this fact that there's, present a panel of folks from, Illumio or wherever it is that you work, of people that come from various different backgrounds that are looking at this problem from various lenses. So that's the one thing, is get into the community. And then the second is to know that this generation is not just apathetic to these issues. We're very aware, savvy. We want to know the answer. We're going to ask the hard questions. So just be ready and be excited and understand, we have to meet each other where we're at in terms of cyber education.
Amazing. Kyla, it's been such a pleasure speaking to you, right? I wish we could have longer, but I know your time is precious. So again, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. It's been fantastic.
Thank you, Raghu. This has been so much fun.
Thank you.